there's opportunity that takes very, very careful and conscious positioning. And it's positioning because, and I'll give you a little bit of my story so you understand this. I grew up in the tropics, Florida, not the Caribbean, but close enough. I spent most of my childhood in and around visiting friends, eating sushi off of boats where people just called it eating raw fish before it became a trend. So very much the nature of my upbringing was local, and it felt local. When I ended up getting into New York, I finally understood through the world of philanthropy what wealth was. And I understood that being in that world of wealth, you needed several things. You needed trust. You needed to understand that the relationships with those who are wealth holders is key, because transaction can ruin relationship in an instant. And if you think about this, think of any of the assets that you all have, or those of you that have children like I do, think of the amount of times your child asks you for something. At some point, you are wary for anything that they want to ask a question of, because it most likely means they want something from you. In the case of my five-year-old this morning, he's discovered that chicken nuggets can come in dinosaur form, and he wants them every day, no matter whether I can supply them or not. When you think about approaching the world of wealth, whether it is next gen or any generation, you have to understand first and foremost that engaging in a world of people who have wealth, influence, and power is still engaging with another human being. There is no difference in the conversation with a billionaire and somebody who works at a restaurant. Everyone is a person, everyone has needs and goals, and everyone has desires that they cannot meet. And the burden and the responsibility of great wealth come at a great cost to many people. So there are many different types of wealth, but with wealth comes power, and how you befriend and build trust with those individuals is one of the major focuses of my talk today. But first, I want to address a little bit of what Bob and Peter spoke about, specifically with generational change. The great wealth transfer is a tremendous fear for many people because it puts power in the hands of those not yet fully powerful. And that is of a concern for every older generation than the generation that will inherit. It was a concern for their generation, for their parents, and their generation before that. So if you look statistically at the way the world has gone, despite current wars, conflicts, COVID, and the rest, we could argue that the world has less violence than ever before. We could also argue that the violence that's in front of us seems more drastic because of the advent of social media. We could look at the fact that the way we are better connected to each other creates opportunity and it creates division. But tribalism has been something that has existed since the dawn of time. And island cultures in particular, and how they've been studied, have proven to be the same exact model for how philanthropy works now, how most groups work now. When you look at the history of island nations, both the Caribbean and the Pacific Isles, the civilizations that failed were mid-size. They were too large for their environment, but they were not large enough to expand, or they were geographically isolated. The most successful countries were those that were smaller, that were self-contained, and that could figure out a natural ecosystem and balance. And the larger ones, which are the larger countries such as Indonesia and the rest, managed to merge those together because they could expand and congeal together. In the world of philanthropy, and impact investing, both since the 2008 global recession, there's no such thing as a mid-sized philanthropy anymore. They are either small islands of philanthropy, or they are massive. In the world of companies and corporations, you either have a unicorn billion-dollar IPO, or you're not a successful startup. You're either a massive conglomerate that gobbles everything else as per those larger nations, or you are small and nimble and you stay that way out of choice for your mission and your effectiveness. So when we look at these levels of how society is structured, there's no difference in philanthropy, impact, business, heritage, culture. The nature of your geography is an asset as long as you embrace that geography. The nature of the way that you are set up and structured in each country that you represent and how you collaborate with each other necessitates a collaboration based on embracing what the next generation's change and focus needs to be. Now, one of the most interesting studies going from the baby boomer generation, which is that generation that has made and inherited this wealth, and the difference in the Gen Z, in the Gen X, and all of these other areas, is activism. A significant amount of those who believed in and grew up in institutions put their faith in institutions. The younger generation statistically shy away from them. My generation, very much at the older age of the cusp of, actually have a fear of institutions, a fear of what a larger group's actions demanding my life take a certain route and continue that route would be. The startups and the new wealth, especially crypto wealth and all of the rest, and NFT and all these new generations that are coming about, want a sense of autonomy from that world of institution. And the greatest fear of the great wealth transfer are those institutions, those financial institutions that currently maintain their power because they maintain the wealth. 80% of wealth managers lose their clients when the older generation passes. And what those wealth managers who lose clients try to do are to get people to see a football game, get people to experience something. What they're not addressing is what that next generation societal needs are. That there are unacceptable consequences for women on this planet by virtue of their gender. That there are unacceptable consequences for not being born with the right skin color to this day. When we talk about ESG, we talk about all the SDG goals. In the end, 80-something% of the world will benefit from societal changes. And with that great wealth transfer, even though some will go from people who are white to people who are white, there's a profound difference in understanding what that power will be. So we're going to pause here from that larger, hopefully compressed recognition of history to understand that family wealth is structured very differently. And the assumption that everyone who is wealthy has access to what their net worth is a false one. A majority of wealth holders have their wealth tied up in the businesses that they run. Therefore, they do not have flexibility in the same way that others might perceive them to, because they take on the responsibility not only for their business and their family, but all of their clients and all of their employees. So when you're approaching a family of means or a business that is substantive and you don't understand what keeps their business ecosystem strong, you miss an opportunity to understand where they need, in particular, public-private partnership to address societal changes and to excite their next generation. When you look at those who have had significant exits, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, it gives them a sense of autonomy and purpose, and it gives them a sense that they are, in many cases, greater than the country in which they reside. For which the crowning example right now, for any of you who tweet, is what will happen with Twitter, with a single individual buying a company. That was unfathomable 30 years ago because people depended on the institutions to leverage it. In this case, Elon Musk was able to leverage the institutions to believe in him because he has made more money for people than those financial institutions have. And he's created a direct means of engagement with him through Twitter. So when we look at the ways that private business and political engagement can be balanced, what we have to understand is, if we are in a global world that has become more tribal because of COVID, we also have a global opportunity. And that global opportunity, more than anything else, is not to course correct after the fact, to chase the wealth that will be inherited, because that wealth could be part of your ecosystems. When you take the steps to actually balance out your values, your political processes, the ease by which business can be done and the ease by which regulation also enforces societal norms. This is where, when we're to look at how to most accurately attract wealth, you need to understand that to attract that properly, you have to take the steps without a belief that because of that, like Field of Dreams, the wealth will come. St. Kitts in particular has become one of the darlings for cryptocurrency and Bitcoin of any sort. And it's because they have taken a regulatory stance that if your wealth is on their island, they will protect it from countries who do not either understand or want to understand what that freedom of a financial currency means. It's in their charter. It's in the way that it has been described by many of my friends now investing their assets there, because it's different to have wealth not in dollars or euros or anything, or pounds or something like this. But there have been people early on in the world of blockchain and cryptocurrency who have had their assets taken from them because what has occurred was a difference in a country's laws and the freedom and the autonomy that comes with an individual's crypto freedom. Now, this is a specific niche, but as an opportunity to attract wealth, there's a difference of being friendly to what the new frontier of finance will be or not. And people will look for where there is more freedom, and they will look for where the regulation is favorable to them, wherever that might be. So when you understand how to engage around these conversations with wealth, you have to understand that the people in the next generation have already done their diligence. They're part of trusted circles. There's not a phone call from a financial manager to some other institution and they bank with you or they visit there. They are actually actively looking to take a stance now as to whether you take a stance for their value system. And those values can be quite different, but predominantly the next generation are what in the US would be determined as socially liberal. They might be fiscally conservative, but they will not tolerate a company being anti-gay or anti-trans. Not only will they not tolerate it, they will not consume it. And in some of them now, if they have the means, take an activist stance to thwart and to stop it. At a conference I spoke at a few months ago, I heard Valerie Rockefeller of the Rockefeller family talk about why she kept her wealth with JP Morgan, despite the fact that the Rockefellers are very much for divesting out of energy solutions that affect climate change and global warming. But her answer was that she would rather stay in it and be in the conversation with a massive, massive institution that continues to invest in this than not. So when you think about why a group, an individual or a business, either local to you or one is trying to attract, would engage with you, the answer always has to be, if they've done their diligence on who they are staying with, they need to see what you stand for before they move to you. This is where we have to understand that future forward countries and the shift to socially conscious business is here to stay, because nearly every business on the planet is based on a consumer market of some sort, either direct to consumer or supporting that. And the thing that people forget to understand, which I consider absolute craziness, is we live in a male-centered, male-dominated business world where 70% of the global consumers or more are women. So why one would continue to maintain a value system that is against the majority sex in the world, I don't understand. Why studies show inherently that every single board of directors with one or more women on them is a more profitable company, every single one, is unfathomable that there's not been a course correction. So when Peter speaks about the 3 C's and speaks about this understanding of what will happen, there are very practical small steps to take. Does the company you own or represent have women on their board? Are the women in the family who owns that company represented as equally as their male counterparts? Gender being the primary divisive factor in what we talk about with ESG. From that, when we talk about people of color, People of color is a euphemism in the United States because our dominant color was white, but that is changing. The global representation of race on this planet is so diffuse, there's not a dominant color. There's not a dominant faith. Therefore, what there are dominant value systems and principles. So if you define those for yourself, whatever those might be, and then you look at the understanding of the business and or country that you represent or reside in, you can take the stance of the institutional response, which is Caribbean islands are gorgeous, tourism should be key. The number of ultra high net worth friends of mine who escaped COVID from New York and other places to move to Grand Bahamas and Aruba and Martinique and many other places. Some chose to stay, but some chose to set up second homes there. They did it because the future of work has changed, even though no one has fully embraced that. And if you can work from everywhere, then why would you not want to be in a place, in an environment that is better for your mental health, possibly better for your children? So we're sitting with things that are directly in front of us. You have one of the most attractive landscapes on the entire planet with one of the most attractive climates ever, especially because the majority of wealthy cities on this planet have really long, horrible winters, especially those that Bob, Peter, and I live in. So why would one not want to make part of your world, if one can do so, a tropical paradise? The other part of this is an understanding that we live in a world where the climate has changed, and some have embraced that, some have not. But every single person who says climate change isn't real still has a delayed flight because of weather, whether they realize what caused it or not. So when we look at the world of environment in particular, your environment is key because you can maintain control of an island different than a multinational company or a massive country. You can maintain control of your value system and embrace that with your own legacy and heritage in a different way than perhaps what currently happens in the United States, where I am from, where our divisiveness never changed in hundreds of years, and people are pretending that what was the onslaught against women actually got better. And now we're in a circumstance where women's rights will be challenged once again, partly because people believe that forward momentum didn't need to be course corrected at a societal level to the same extent. So if you want to be activist, if you want to be focused on exactly where you can position yourselves, and as part of this incredible conference and part of these ongoing dialogues, there's one practical thing I can give you before we move to the question and answer and commentary from Bob and Peter on this. Who would you trust your kids with or your family with? Because when one is a wealth holder, when one has responsibility, that's the question one asks, because what happens honestly all the time for wealth holders is, for next generation, can I have access to your parents or your uncle or your grandparents, giving no value to you? What happens with those who have made an incredible amount of wealth is that everyone wants to catch up to ask something of them. There is a reason why the active is wealth holders. And there's a difference between those that inherit and drive race cars and love life or pretend to, and those that take an activist stance in bettering their society. So I'm addressing for you those that are taking an activist stance. You cannot hide anything about how your company works, how your country works. You cannot excuse the past or the history of it. But what you can do clearly is embrace a value system for change that allows you to be adaptable to attract this wealth, to connect you to the wealth currently on your island nations, and to understand that if you ignore the power of women, if you ignore the advent of what is happening with climate change, if you do not look at the idea that you cannot convince people to invest in the ecosystem you have to convince them to invest in the ecosystem that you and the entrepreneurs in your country will build. To attract this right needs to be the right balance so that you are not islands of tourism. To attract it is that you are not catering to something because wealth will come to you. The truest sense of this is to embrace the sense that if you lead with your values in this, what will come from it is a much more clear stance that you attracted the people because you were like-minded, because you made a public stance at the United Nations that climate change is real and the developing world needs a consideration for that well beyond a pat on the back, that as coastal erosion continues and tourism declines, that one can still function. So there's great power to understand in the fact that if you were to combine all of women and quote people of color on this world, it's no longer a minority. If you combine the power of smaller island nations together, what you get is a flexibility to be nimble and a flexibility to be powerful in a way that a larger single country cannot be. So if you embrace change and you embrace this understanding that what you have collectively is a power and a understanding that you need to transition in the next 5 to 10 years for this to be the case, to attract these next generations, to make sure that you are the bridge between or amongst the wealth of the Americas in particular, and those ties directly to Europe, and the ties to Africa and Asia that have very similar challenges. What one can do through this is build a greater society for that change to occur. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. Peter and Bob, I'll hand it back to you. And it was such a pleasure to be able to give this opening keynote. Kamala, I appreciate the consideration.
Thank you very much, David. That was such an inspiring keynote. I've taken so many notes, but I will tell you, underline all of that. I felt so inspired and I felt so positive by the message that you shared. You know, as small islands, we can be agile. We can ensure that we are not held back by our history. And we can focus on what a future can look like if we collaborate and co-create, as Peter said. So I want to bring Peter into the discussion now and have him and Professor Garratt share their thoughts.
Certainly. Well, again, congratulations, David. That was not only emotively moving, but also inspirational and gave many, many practical solutions and really helped to connect the dots. But again, you have that superpower like very few others in this world, and bringing together those communities. Look, there are key areas that were obviously discussed, but I think what David was saying in his own very eloquent way is something that I also touched upon as well previously. And this is an ecosystem, and it's not a promotion. And a lot of people approach the ultra high net worth community, again, in a transactional way without understanding those core values, how they think, and aligning those interests. And it's not the same as having a delegation, usually in an embassy somewhere around the world, with a trade commissioner, and they just essentially meet all the businesses and all the people of wealth. You need to actually stand for something, and stand for something in a unified way. Because what it's proven from time and time again, I've found that the Caribbean now does have a way of interfacing globally. We've talked about how the I believe Bermuda and Bahamas have done very well in insurance, Cayman extraordinarily well in trusts and structures, but they're practical type of situations and solutions you've provided. With the virtual global citizen now, it's a different world. And the world is small and it's borderless. So what you thought was only going to be capable in person now is somewhat eradicated, and you have the chance to create that opportunity together. And that activism component that he mentioned as well, particularly if you look at the ultra high net worth community, is obviously trickling down into the institutional world. Because when you understand the family office and the private wealth component, and David quite rightly mentioned, a huge proportion of those families still have a strong business interest and aligned to it. And if you look at Asia, a big portion of the family offices are a fairly new concept in Asia. So they still have a strong traditional and cultural and even philosophical link and a responsibility to society and their employees, because they feel that they're interconnected. and they are in their own way practicing the 3 Cs. So that approach I can completely concur with. That is a huge way to go. And of course, there are situations like you mentioned with Elon Musk having a huge amount of influence over the institutional world. People think, again, that don't know that to buy Twitter, that he's just signing a check for $40 billion. He's not. He's actually got access to certainly several billions in private wealth, but he's got the trust of other co-investors and institutions that are going to go in with him. So in your case, of course, you may want to consider, of course, what are the key movements, what are the key value systems, and what is these activists, what do they want, not just in their own private way, but governmentally and institutionally? Because in a unified way, this is where you can be very, very strong in execution and, of course, in creating a value system and almost like that trusted family-like environment. And again, David could elaborate perhaps a little later about what orchestrated connections is. And it's essentially a very highly trusted private community of people of great integrity and aligned interests. I've practiced business that way. And what I love about the City of London, although some would debate it's eroding, there is a belief that a person's word is their bond, their word is their honor. And when you create that cultivation, I think that there's a lot to be done. Again, I also agree, and there's an interesting book that's gone out in the UK called Butler to the World, and it talks about how the UK and a number of countries have become essentially that to the ultra rich. Well, again, I think seeing yourselves as partners to these people and co-creators, co-elevators, and collaborators, as opposed to their butler to collect a fee, is how you'll get to not just register their entity and get a tax break, but actually be the place they want to maybe headquarter some of their activities, and even bring businesses that have an on-the-ground presence with the Caribbean region and employ and then uplift the human capital development of your great nations. Again, I could go on and on because there are so many key points, but I'd love to hear Bob's views on this, particularly on his points on governance and ESG and how it aligns with what David discussed. So on to you, Bob.
Well, I'd like to come back to that at the end of the session. I'll just reinforce what you said. In today's Financial Times, there's a whole page article on the notion of the City of London becoming much more a global professional services centre, ranging from architecture and design right the way through. So not just on financial services. But no, I want to learn today. So I prefer to have the audience asking questions of David. We have him for very limited time, so I don't want to spout on. Please, can we have questions of David? What's going on in people's minds out there? What has David triggered?
So, and I too am happy to take any questions from our participants today. But I want to share, David, what I felt particularly inspired about was the notion that we can be agile, we can be co-creators, but we don't need to know exactly what the future will look like. That working together, we can evolve what that looks like, because at the moment, the world is changing so fast, and all of us may have our own visions of what we may want to achieve for our organizations. But I think very practically, we can recognize that the 10-year strategic plans really ought not to be implemented blindly without taking into account all the many things that are changing the way the world is functioning today. So I would want to ask you, you spoke about the fact that, the geography itself can be an asset, because you said small islands, and that the research has proven this, that they are able to be more nimble, I want to ask you to share a little bit more on that, because we have persons here from Jamaica, from Barbados, from Guyana, and of course here in Trinidad and Tobago as well. So we have all heard very often the need for having things like the ease of doing business, putting the regulations in place that are welcoming. But I want you to share a bit more on the research that shows in terms of small islands, what we can do and how we can make a difference.
Absolutely. So there's an incredible book called Collapse by Jared Diamond. It is probably for me the Bible of understanding this, because it looked at specifically why certain nations succeeded and certain nations failed. So I quoted the essence of that because I read a lot of very dry, sometimes hard to understand nonfiction, partly because it helps me fall asleep, but also just because I find it incredible to understand society in a slightly different way. And the real research is evident by the fact that the Caribbean as a whole has maintained its independence of an incredible amount of small nations. Now that comes with the quote conquest of America, so to speak, and the mingling of European and African and indigenous populations. But I think I mentioned this exact thing last time, but the world of saying location, location, location. It's not coincidental that Miami is the new New York, not just for people who are cold to go to, but for business, because it attracts the wealth of South America, Central America, and North America. Miami is an extremely crowded, congested, wonderful city my mother grew up in. Everyone who lives in Miami doesn't vacation to Miami. Guess where they go? They're going somewhere tropical. They go to where one of you lives, or one of you have your businesses, where you have your governments. And the old advent used to be, for instance, all my friends, Kamala, who go to your incredible country do complain about the price of dinner because it's not cheap. Getting there might be, but sustaining yourself there as a tourist, not the same. Because the current economy is partly built on the fact that tourists can cover that. If you were to look at Puerto Rico as a different part of the United States, but island nation, they are now attracting an incredible amount of US-based wealth and businesses that are by necessity tied to the United States, but people want a different location. Friends of mine there are tackling child poverty. They're tackling upward mobility, entrepreneurship, because the corporations who set up businesses there need employees who live there. It's a simple thing people forget. So workforce training, upward mobility, how does this exist now? If you look at the success of island nations in history, they came together specifically because they had to survive. Small ones that could travel to each other lived together. Others that were isolated stayed isolated, but thrived because their population did not outgrow their land. The human body is the same situation. If you eat too much, then your organs cannot handle the growth of your body, and you have a premature death. So when you look at this in the context of opportunity, you have to work with what you have and you have to change it. You can't add to it. That's what the opportunity is in terms of changing your history. Certain islands have an incredible amount of women leaders, women in government. Some do not. Who do you think will be more attractive to a socially conscious investor? Some have local business and it is local. Some have accepted basically the business that cater to the cruise line industry. And they're all tourism focused. There's nothing there when something goes wrong, such as COVID. You take away tourism, what happens? So when you diversify, which is what Peter probably lectures everyone on the planet about with financial literacy, you gain strength. So not every island needs to do the same thing. But if you're going to do it correctly, then you cannot ride the waves of what your history was. You have to position yourself for what your history will be to attract the right energy and attention.
Yes, thank you very much, David. I think that really it does help. And, you know, from what you had shared, it helps to one, understand that tourism can't be the one major focus that we're looking at for growth. And also we need to take into account the fact that we don't have the rest of the world looking after our affairs. For instance, the global minimum tax, which has now been passed, means that smaller nations will suffer, because usually one of the ways that they would have attracted business into the region is through tax breaks. Now that that's taken away, it means that the countries need to find alternative means, alternative ideas for how they could deal with that. And having mentioned women leaders, there's no way we could not acknowledge the innovation and creativity that came out of Barbados under Mia Mottley. It was in fact the one country that took account of what COVID meant and offered that 1-year passport for persons to be able to relocate easily from any part of the world where they may be stuck inside in cold weather, to come to Barbados, where they could settle behind their laptops and be able to continue to work. And I think that's the kind of innovation that we are looking for. But as you say, it doesn't have to be that each island trying to do the same thing and competing with each other in that same space. And that's why it's so important for us to be able to have the conversation as well, so that we can dialogue to decide how can we work together in collaboration in order to make a bigger pie for how we can all benefit. And I am seeing a comment from Maria Chongtang. She says, the wealth of the islands tend to move to North America, UK, and even Europe. So Maria, would you like to elaborate on that comment for us in 1 minute? We just have about 3 more minutes for the session, but if you want to, and do you want to pose a question or comment to David in that regard?
Yeah, I was wondering, we're exploring attracting wealth here, but traditionally in my experience, I find when families or businesses want to grow, they tend to go outside. So we move the wealth and then they settle outside. People tend to buy properties and businesses. I don't know if the rest of the participants experience that, but that seems to be the norm in my experience. Does that have an impact on this session, that we are looking at attracting this wealth, creating wealth here?
It does, absolutely, Maria. And it's an incredible point to mention. I know we're almost at time, so I'll try to do it as succinctly as possible. Wealth attracts wealth. Wealth needs opportunity. Wealth needs diversity. However, because I do have friends from island nations who all live in New York or Miami, their identity is still tied there, even if they don't live there. The difference is some groups will offer opportunity to tie things back and some will not. It doesn't mean you can attract all of it, but people look at that wealth, especially when it is inherited or earned, as a chance to escape. Then they go somewhere else and they're still pinned down as that person from Jamaica. The tie-in needs to be in the fact that what attracts people there doesn't need to keep them there permanently, but it needs to create ties that mean that it's very hard to walk away because of investments, because of philanthropy, because of public-private partnerships, so that a responsibility with that wealth is tied to the growth of the country. And in some cases that has been done correctly, but it's often been ignored except for taxes for quite some time. And I don't have a solution for this because each case is individual, but I know from friends, for instance, in the Grand Bahamas, that they're working on building an entire ocean incubator to understand ocean life as part of their family business, which also involves the port of the Grand Bahamas. So they took an activist stance to stay there, despite having homes other places, because what they realized was that the Caribbean infrastructure and the ecology of the area necessitated a focus on climate change, which then needs a policy focus at the United Nations. And that is what we are seeing in climate change, that island nations are especially taking a stance on this, because all of you suffer more greatly than the developed world with what is occurring there alone.
Thank you so much, David. Peter, would you like to make any closing remarks or so as we end this first session, the opening keynote for this, our three-part Great Wealth Transfer series?
Well, actually, one thing, as a matter of fact, I'd love for David to actually to bring us home. And whenever I get a global expert of any area, I always like to ask them about their area of expertise and their highest priority, their hot tip, or their greatest recommendation. So look, David, I'll probably put this one to you. If you had to pick one social impact or ESG issue, and also one investment area or USP that the Caribbean should focus on to galvanize, of course, greater interface and understanding and links with the next generation, what would those two things be in terms of the movement on impact and ESG, and perhaps something from a business perspective that you think could be a great unison with the next gen community?
It's a great question, Peter, and people will always look to figure out something new. I don't believe there needs to be anything new, because the wealth of this world travel to the Caribbean already. Partly they do so during colder months where they mostly live, because it's really cold. So you have them there. They are escaping colder environments because of climate change. It's one of the single most important factors on our planet. I do not know a single next-gen friend of mine who isn't involved in some way in that. And so the answer is what is staring one right in the face, which is a tourism economy can pivot to become a tourism climate-focused economy very easily. And that would be the quickest answer I could give, knowing we're at time. Because if one pivots to take all these societal values and the tourists going there see something more there in terms of what is possible for investment in and study of oceans, climate change, modular housing, that it could affect the developing world in terms of how to deal with a hurricane or a monsoon. There's an incredible amount of innovation that an individual investor could not work from, but an island could. My friend Blaine has a business called Shorelock. It's an eco-friendly business that when you put these biodegradable devices 4 feet under the beach during hurricanes, there's little to no shore erosion. He's at the point now where at some point an island nation will find him and will say, we're going to invest in this. But it's an investable business that could have ramifications for a country globally with the amount of shores that are under disrepair and nor damage. And an island can take that stance because it's your backbone. There's innovation for protection that relate directly to tourism sitting in front of us. That is what I would say would be the singular focus, because it's the singular focus on what people know currently of the Caribbean as a whole. They know nothing about the incredible hybrid natures of heritage, song, dance, music, art, flavors, food, spices, things I know because I've been and I want to go back. They don't know that because it's not something that defines their global perspective. This does.
And probably part,
yeah.
David, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, because it's May in New York and I have to wear a long sleeve jacket outside in May because it's cold today and it shouldn't be. So that's the thing that people sit in their face and they look at. And we sat through a horrible cold winter in New York. Would have been nice to be able to work from an island as opposed to my apartment. with the heat on. Simple things are how people look at this. And I think that simple focus has a possibly grandiose benefit to the Caribbean as a whole.
Okay. And part two, David, let's just say for argument's sake, and we'll do a hypothetical, but let's just say every single Caribbean nation decided we want to get behind the Great Wealth Transfer and the Next Generation Initiative, and they appointed you as their president for 1 year. What do you think are the key factors to open the dialogue with the next generation community you know well, and to form the 3 C's with that next generation community? If you had 1 year as president of Next Gen appointed by every Caribbean nation, how would you get it going, and what, and how would that work?
Well, my first step, Peter, would be to appoint you vice president, because I'd be needing a lot of help, and I'd appoint Bob the prime minister or whatever the government structure was. Then I'd hand all the power back to Kamala, who's put all this together in the first place, because 3 white guys shouldn't be in charge of this. It should really be people there. So that's my fair answer. But in terms of what you're getting at, entrepreneurs need space, they need funding, they need time. If you have an island that can feed somebody and house somebody and incubate them to try out their solutions for climate change in real life, who would say no? Island nations as a whole can leverage in a really unbelievable way their collective power at the United Nations and with the businesses that are tied to their local infrastructure, especially those tied to tourism. I would leverage public-private partnership into entrepreneurship and ecosystems. I would focus specifically on climate change, and I would find it unacceptable to work with any business that only had white men in charge and white men on the board. And I would take that stance because it would make global ramifications instantly. That we need gender balance and color balance and a focus on climate change the developing world is ignoring, because we're crying over the loss of our supposed net worth or GDP from COVID, compared to a significant amount of the world that still can't get shots and whose economies will take a decade to recover. The world listens. What they need are people to take a stance and say these values of yours need to be ours, and we cannot function or grow. So what we are doing is we are going to be welcoming and address this as a crisis, as a problem, because it affects all of us, not just us. And you bring in great minds, you bring in incredible environments with the advent of social media, where Instagram has exploded by people creating climate solutions on a beach as opposed to a basement apartment in Brooklyn. And what you end up getting is a social focus on one of the most precious ecosystems on the planet, whose ecological success is contingent on our ozone layer staying, whose growth as a collective environment will occur and will show that when the dominant language in the world is no longer English, it can either be variations of Spanish or Mandarin. And there's 2 ways that works: either a global perspective on bringing the Americas together, or a divergent perspective on how the fragmented world of the Caribbean is or is not part of the Americas, as they need to come together when we have a regional need to keep manufacturing close for ecological reasons and reasons that occurred during COVID, where we were dependent in the Americas on supplies from Asia, India, that we could not get. So the world has woken up to what the global supply chain needs to correct to. That global supply chain will also very clearly become a more ecologically friendly one. So if we're sitting with a shipping infrastructure, a travel infrastructure, and the people who live here or live in Europe also go to the Caribbean, that year would be making sure they all know who each other are and what their ties are, and I would change it from there.